people ascribe that somehow there are issues of the design of the retirement system, the way the retirement system works is, I mean, it's actually the tail wagging the dog, in the sense that that's not a criticism of the retirement system. It wouldn't matter if it's a defined benefit plan, a defined contribution plan. It wouldn't matter. The issue is they're not covered at all, is the problem. And it wouldn't matter what kind of plan it is. Now, I know there are, many people who have been critical of defined contribution and 401k plans. And as someone who has spent my career in this area, Paul, I would say that some of that criticism is certainly justified. But I will also say that I think there is a lot of reason for some optimism going forward, because I think employers are now understanding that getting workers to save, and to save at the levels they need to save, is not a question necessarily singularly of education. In other words, if we give them more brochures, they'll finally get it, they'll enroll, and they'll save at the level they need. It's actually a question of how you design the 401k plan. So I have to give a shout out here to my good friend Senator Harkins, sitting in the front row, because he and I have talked about many, many times that the most positive piece of pension legislation post-ERISA in 1974 was the Pension Protection Act of 2006 that Tom took a lead on, that validated the sort of behavioral economics techniques that we know actually work with respect to private retirement plans. So things like automatic enrollment and step-up contributions and target date default options, to the point where I recently saw that one of the biggest critics, and again, understandably so, I'm not critical, but Alicia Munnell, who is very, very, very well regarded and has spent her career in this area, now says she will no longer deride defined contribution plans for producing less savings than a traditional pension. So my point is, Paul, there is kind of a new wave of plan design that is sweeping across the employer community, recognizing that we have to do better with respect to workplace retirement plans. And I could talk for the rest of the day around that, but I'll stop there.
Well, but the arguments against are that you're putting decision-making in people's hands. They're going to make the wrong decisions about investments, right?
They do not act in their own financial self-interest. That's the way I describe it.
Yeah, or are taken advantage of.
Well,
I don't mean to be personal.
No, I don't think it's they're taken advantage of.
I mean, that's one of the criticisms.
Well, what happens is that they decide, I just don't want to decide today, and then they never get back to it.
And that's the genius of the nudge.
Right.
The nudge philosophy. And that's interestingly sort of bipartisan, or at least partially bipartisan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's the idea of, hey, you just restructure the contract in a way, makes people opt in. Right, they have to opt out. As opposed to being automatically opt in. That is, you're automatically signed up unless you say no.
And so coverage,
just that one little change.
Yeah, coverage goes from 65% to closer to 90%.
Yeah, and
with just that change.
And remember, a lot of these plans have employer contributions, so it's literally insane or financially illiterate not to sign up, right? If your employer is putting money into the program, right? And yet, lots and lots of people didn't do it because of the paradox of choice, if you will. You get paralyzed by the number of options or decisions you have to make.
Right.
We're on pensions, 401ks.
Yeah, so I'll just mention that I think one of the successes of Social Security is because it is mandatory opting in. I mean, you don't have an option, but it is a universal opt-in program. I think it's been wonderful that that bit of behavioral economics has had a policy impact in terms of pushing for opt-out programs that you have to, or automatic enrollment programs, because I think that has been one of the biggest boosts of pension participation. I'm a big pusher of financial literacy. Even when you have mandatory participation, people can opt out, and they have shown that when you have mandatory participation, individuals are less likely to move up beyond the default contribution limit. So you you gain by having more participants, you lose by having fewer participants contributing more, and therefore you make some people better off over the long run, but other people less well off. And so you still need some push to save more even when you have mandatory participation.
And of course, it's tougher to save more given all your data, David,
Yes.
on what's happening.
Yes, and another reason it's very tough, in addition to that people don't have money, the other reason it's tough is that the vast majority of people save in workplace retirement. Outside of Social Security, people save in workplace retirement plans. It's sort of set up for them. It's easy. Very few people save on their own. The problem, a key problem, is that a big chunk of the population, about 40%, do not have access to a workplace plan at all, and that makes them very unlikely to save for retirement. So
I just want to add one little thing, because I just learned this about a week and a half ago from a scholar. I think it's 44% of Americans get the majority of their income from W-2s, not from 1099s, not from W-2s.
well, that's a related issue to this, which is, so lots of people don't have retirement plans at work, and the nature of work itself is changing, where fewer and fewer people actually have an employer.
Right, and that's the
one
point.
consistent employer. And so the kind of private sector system you want to set up, I think, is going to include everyone, not just those people who are fortunate enough to work for a employer who chooses to offer a retirement plan. And we see a lot of movement here at the states, and I think Kathleen Kennedy Townsend will talk more about that, and that's what her center does a lot of work studying. But California, Illinois, for example, are really starting to lead the way in figuring out how to create a good retirement plan for those people who do not have plans at their workplace. And they will take many of the best elements of the kind of 401k system, but they're also starting to think about how you deal with the payout phase, because that's one of the other problems with the current system for 401ks. So you can accumulate, but then you are supposed to be your own actuary. How long are you going to live? How do you spend down your assets? And that's a very complicated set of issues. So thinking about that payout phase is also something that the retirement plans that work need to think through better. And there's a lot of solutions. In fact, I worked with Senator Harkin on a very good bill that I think deals with that structure that kind of provides a little bit of a hybrid between the 401k and the pension to provide lifetime payouts.
We're going to go to the questions now. I just want to say that as somebody who now is facing the payout phase myself personally, I'm literally have a scheduled conversation on Tuesday with when do I have to take the minimum withdrawal, how can I do it so that I can transfer the money to my IRAs from other places to my current employer so that I don't have to do the payout, what's going to be future taxation, so when is the right point at which to take these things. It is unbelievably complex, even for somebody who spent his entire career trying to explain these things to other people. So Q&A, please, if we could. Some questions from the audience. Yeah, back there. How are we doing this? Can people just yell, or do we have a mic? Oh, we have a mic. All right. You can do both. A mic is coming to you, sir. And if you just briefly introduce yourself, just tell us who you are, and then the question is directed.
Hi, I'm Arun Muralidhar, and I'm with Kathleen's Georgetown Center for Retirement Initiatives. I want to take up the point about whether or not there's an issue with Social Security, and I don't think it goes so much to the assumptions or the time horizon, but it's purely a structural issue. And Professor Modigliani and I wrote a book about this at least about 15 years ago. And what we argued is fundamentally where Social Security fails globally, not just in the US, is the method of financing. It's not a defined benefits problem, it's the funding method, which is pay-as-you-go, which makes the contributions really susceptible to very small changes in either demographics or productivity. And what we argued for, because we were very much against the privatization approach of the World Bank, was that you should convert Social Security into a partially funded system where it's also partially invested in the market. Now, back in the Clinton administration, we could have done it because you had potential surpluses that you could have used to start funding this process. But now, with all the changes that have taken place, that's going to be a huge challenge. But I want the panel to address this point about should we change the structure of financing Social Security, because I think that's completely missed in the debate.
Karen, you were starting to talk about that, or it was connected to what you were saying, that with how, all these other programs are in deficit also, but because of the way we account for Social Security, they are not looked at in the same way. Could you start?
Well, actually, that was a choice that the original Social Security Advisory Committee debated, whether to have a fully or partially funded system. Japan tried that, and it took a long time for them to ever build up to adequate benefits, and that's sort of the trade-off. I think part of the debate now is whether to have a partially funded system, because in some ways we do. We have a trust fund, and the debate is now about how do we have a sustaining pay-as-you-go system, but we could be having a debate about whether we should maintain the trust fund. And perhaps that would be even more convincing to the high-income individuals if we had that debate, to maintain a trust fund. That might speak more to individuals who believe in savings and providing for the future.
Larry?
First, I agree with Karen that I would argue from an actuarial perspective, I would argue we have a partially funded system today because we do have a trust fund. I mean, my definition of a pay-as-you-go system would literally be that there's no trust fund. That's where we'd get to in 2035. That's a true pay-as-you-go in my judgment. So we have a partially funded system, and I think your question would be with respect to should we change, the way I would describe your point is should we change the funding philosophy of Social Security so that rather than funding it over this period that involves not only your working years but your retirement years. That's, by the way, why we choose a 75-year period, because that's the period over which most people both work and receive benefits. And so rather than do that, should we collapse that funding philosophy, and we would be funding each generation of workers over the period within which they worked. That would be an alternate funding philosophy that we could go to, but that again would exchange, higher tax rates in the short term for a larger trust fund. He doesn't agree, but so maybe you want to.
Well, no. Let's take other questions, because we could get stuck on this. It was just that Alan Greenspan, facing that issue, said he was afraid that the United States, that the Social Security's trust fund would then own all the securities in the stock market, and that would be a terrible thing. So.
Right.
Good morning. Mark Miller with Reuters, and my question is for Larry. And Larry, the question has to do with the state auto IRA proposals that David referenced in places like California and Illinois. The insurance industry has been one of the key leading opponents of the creation of these plans. And my understanding is that one of the reasons is that one of the key arguments I've heard in my reporting on this is that the folks that these plans would seek to serve already have access to retirement products in the retail market, IRAs. But it seems to me that misses the value of something going on in the workplace via payroll deduction, and it also ignores, that argument also ignores these behavioral nudge arguments that Paul was referencing, the ability to auto-enroll and auto-escalate people, build in features perhaps down the road like annuitization. So my question is, why the strong opposition to what seems to me to be a very reasonable and modest way to get coverage increased at a point when we're 3 decades into the 401k experiment and we still have a huge percentage of the workforce not covered with a retirement plan in the workforce?
Right. So first of all, I would say that while you can find people within the sort of investment management world, not only insurance companies but mutual funds and others, that have some concern about it, I don't believe that it's a kind of philosophical concern. I believe it's a very practical concern that would suggest that based on our years of experience, we're not really sure that it would move the needle in terms of closing that coverage gap. We totally agree. We are completely aligned behind wanting to close the coverage gap, and the question really is, what is the best methodology for doing that? I think that a proper role for state and local and federal governments, and again, Senator Hark and I have talked about this a lot, is in the area of public education around the need to save for retirement. I use this analogy. I hope it doesn't sound trivial, but this is a little bit like the 50s when we had, as I understand it, lots of forest fires. And the government went out, created Smokey the Bear, did a lot of public education over a couple of decades, and in large, that problem was somewhat minimized. Why? We need to spend more time educating the American public about their need to save for their own retirement. Now, if states want to get into the retirement business in the very same way that Principal and other private providers have to do it, with full fiduciary responsibilities, full fiduciary obligations, in every bit the same way, I don't have any problem with that. I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't favor allowing states to come in with lesser obligations to the underlying retirement savers than what would be true in the private sector. I think that doesn't make sense. I think that is illogical, and yet at the moment, I believe, Mark, it's fair to say the Department of Labor is moving down that path to actually instruct states how to not have ERISA apply. I think that is the wrong direction.
David, I know you must have an attitude to this because you brought up these state plans earlier.
I think one of the key features of these kind of public plans is that they seek to limit the total fees that are charged to participants. Just to give a sort of sense of scope of fees, these are charged, there's a percentage of assets, and they mostly, for most people, they're averaging around 1%. That might sound like a relatively small thing, but over a person's lifetime, that sort of charge compared to a lower cost charge could eat up about 20 to 30% of their entire savings, because that sort of reduces the growth you get at each year. And so there are these quite high fee products in the marketplace that I think are threatened by these public sector plans that really will seek to manage and reduce costs. The analogy, the lowest cost plan that is out there right now is the Federal Thrift Savings Plan, which has dramatically lower fees than most every other plan out there. And so I think by providing lower cost products, these public plans are a huge service to people and will enable them to accumulate much larger retirement assets than they would otherwise, and they're threatening to some particular players.
And I'll just add that the California Secure Choice Plan is currently conducting research to find out what some of the potential results of these plans would be, and that we should have answers soon to some of this.
Okay, two more questions here. Right over here, please. The mic. What happened to the mic over here? I know I've called on her. I didn't know you'd already picked somebody, but we'll get to that person next, and you can get a little more exercise.
Thank you. Ramsay Almond with the National Council on Aging. Given the Great Recession and the hit that folks took with the private market and how steady and secure Social Security is, what do you think the political will, the public debate, what kind of shift do we need to see in order to have a hearty conversation about strengthening Social Security, especially for the most vulnerable, given the economic realities of boomers and older adults today, their reliance on Social Security? Really, the conversation has been about solvency, but given what we know about private market solutions, we need to strengthen what we know works. But what type of political will or reframing in the public dialogue needs to happen in order to really open up that conversation?
Sorry, go ahead, Kilolo, please.
Jump in.
Sure.
If you go outside the Beltway, that is already underway. There is public education, grassroots public education going on across the country about the need to improve the adequacy of benefits, and there's quite a bit of support for it. I mentioned the poll that was taken by NACI at least for a couple of years, and so we're talking about strengthening Social Security through improving the minimum benefit, making it really effective for low-wage earners, by increasing the survivor's benefit to 75% of what the couple would have received. Other ways of improving benefits would be adding a caregiver credit, I should say. So there are a number of ways in which benefits can be made more secure for people who are at the lower end of the
What's the Smokey the Bear? What's the Smokey the Bear solution to the question she asks? How do we reframe in a way that does for Social Security or pensions what Smokey the Bear did for forest fires? Although the forest fire thing may be a little problematic, right? Because maybe we stopped the forest fire. I knew the worst forest fires.
I knew I was taking a risk with that, Paul, but every once in a while,
yeah,
you throw one in, right?
It's a little tricky.
Yeah. So again, I just would say that I think we do need a recommitment, actually a commitment in this country to financial literacy, and I think Kilolo maybe mentioned that earlier, and I know it's been mentioned a couple of times, and I think that's one thing that all of us in this room would probably agree on. And again, I'm, as someone who's done a lot of work in that area, I would encourage all of you to get active in that. The reality is that until we start teaching the younger generations the basics of financial literacy, I believe, Paul, we're going to be, unfortunately, we're going to see many of the same behaviors that we saw prior to the financial crisis that did hurt middle income and lower income workers, so badly. And so I think it's, regardless of what our beliefs may be with respect to Social Security or 401ks, we could agree that we need to do a better job of helping the younger generations understand the basics of financial literacy.
I think we also have to educate people about good management and how well the Social Security fund is managed, and therefore could sustain the effects of the recession. I belong to a pension system, the Wisconsin retirement system, which is fully funded, has amazing, I do a lot of work on it, has amazing features that have allowed it to maintain its benefit promises. I mean, it has take-backs, it has all kinds of safety features in it. So I get very distressed when I hear the rhetoric about how all state funds are in jeopardy, and it's because of bad management. So, and clearly 401ks were more hit by the recession, and so we just need a whole discussion about good management of different kinds of funds, that it's not a catastrophic world out there. There have been mistakes, and there are ways to have a secure retirement in whatever way you wish to do it.
David?
And I just add, I actually think, done some research on this. I would say retirement security is sort of a sleeper issue. There is deep public concern about their ability to retire with dignity and security. There is rising concern over periods of time. There's broad support for a whole range of solutions, and the public puts this as if not the most, probably the most important long-term economic priority. And so at some level, I think we're at a moment where a smart political leader could start to take this issue up. And you're seeing it, I think, at the state level, where states, I mentioned California and Illinois, where really ambitious young political leaders are taking this issue up, and I think they see it as a step forward for them, because they are speaking to real fears and needs in the public, and see an opportunity to go forward with this. So I think retirement security has a potential to be a much bigger issue going forward.
The last question over there.
I'm Gobind Prasad. I'm a faculty member here in the McDonough School of Business. I was interested in the framing of Social Security as insurance and thinking about what the risk retirement security is insuring against in light of the question of how to expand, look at potential other sources of funding. So if we think of it as insurance against outliving one's retirement savings in retirement, then it seems like a really natural place to look for funding would be something like a wealth or an estate tax. If you're fortunate enough not to outlive your savings, you have sort of a social responsibility to pay something back into the system. So particularly in light of all the recent concern about intragenerational lack of mobility, why does it make sense to try to look at general revenues for shoring up the system as opposed to looking something like an estate tax or a wealth tax alternative?
Who wants to
I think
take
I mentioned all those solutions as possible solution sets. As I think, we'll see exactly how far to go with those concepts. But I meant there's a whole range of income and wealth that we are not taxing to think about Social Security, and we also could think about general support, especially for the legacy costs that for paying previous generations more than they paid in. So I think those are definitely they are not where the mainstream debate is, but I think they are possibilities going forward.
I will end with, Karen.
I was just going to say, and that was one of the debates of the original advisory council of whether to have general financing. We have general fund financing of our Medicare benefits, and so that might be one topic to raise now.
I only end this with something a young person once said to me, which is, if you can't tax rich dead people, who can you tax?
Thank you. I want to thank this terrific panel. Yesterday a lot of us were glued to the television or the radio for the Benghazi hearings, right? A lot of us. And so it's so refreshing to listen to, a day later, an intelligent, civil, and productive discussion. Thank you all. Thank you to the panel.